back to the channel, everyone. Today's project, well, actually it's going to take probably more like a week or two, is to rebuild a snowblower from various machines that I picked up. Now, I picked up this first one here about a year ago, a little over a year ago, and I bought it kind of towards the end of the season. I got it real cheap. Not sure why. There's a grill brush there. Maybe we can grill on it later. Picked it up really cheap. It's like 40 bucks. It's got a good drivetrain in it. It actually looks like it's in pretty good condition. Very little rust on it. Unfortunately, the pins all look good on it. But unfortunately, there was no engine. But I got it super cheap. Tires are in good condition. And I thought it would make a nice snowblower for my parents. All I need to do is get a motor for it. And I realized afterwards that I didn't have any of the gear assembly, so even though I could get a motor, I was missing all of that parts. And then this past summer, I picked up this one here, which I got for 40 bucks. But as you can see, this has got a whole lot of rust, a whole lot of issues with the chute, but it's got a complete engine and a complete belt assembly here. And I was told that the engine ran, although I have not tried it yet, but I was told the engine ran the last time they used it. So what I'm gonna do is take everything I can off of this guy and put it onto this guy. Now, these are pretty close to the same thing. One's a Yardman, one's a Yard Machine. A lot of these were made by the same company. The design is pretty much the same. There's not a whole lot of difference in design for these things. So I'm gonna start by changing the oil in this, cleaning out the carburetor, see if we can get this to run. If this will run, great. If not, I'll pick up another cheap engine from Harbor Freight and match up to the drive assembly that we have on this guy here. And then we'll have one good machine using parts from these two. And I think I'm going to use this frame, this chute, that engine, probably this control assembly. We'll attach that here like it is over there, just because it has the better hand controls and the much better chute control. So this particular one has the chute tilt back here, so you can adjust it back here, which is awesome. And all the drive controls are here. And it just needs an auger clutch because the auger clutch is busted on this, the cable running down for the auger. And then the directional control right here works just fine. On this guy, there is no adjustment for the chute, but we have a good auger clutch and a good drive control. And the drive control up here is in a decent location, so if we have to, we can use that one. Between the two of them, we'll get a working snow throwing machine. Anytime you're working with an engine like this, it's been sitting a long time, the first thing you want to do is change the oil. It's a little dark, but it wasn't too bad. I'm going to put some brand new oil in it before I even try to start it. I want to make sure there's no water in it. It hasn't, because it's been sitting outside, and just make sure it's ready to start. And that is the sound of the electric start not working, so we're going to have to go to the hand start. But first we'll need some gas in there. It's not running very well, but that doesn't surprise me because on these smaller engines, when the carburetor sits for a while, they'll get gummed up and they just won't work all that well. Discovered a long time ago that you can buy replacement carburetors much cheaper than you can fix the ones you have. So if you have the option to wait a couple of days, get a carburetor off of Amazon for 10-15 bucks and you're back in business. I got it running somewhat okay and did a quick test of the drivetrain. Everything seems to be okay on that, and we're ready to start ripping it apart. So my main goals here were to keep the same chute and the same controls, just because they were all right up there hand level, bending over, and you had the ability to adjust the chute remotely. So I'm going to try and get the old one off, and it looks like they're going to fit and be interchangeable between the two of them. But once we get that off, we can pop that on. The older model here that I'm working on now, they were bolted down. The other one had a nice little fold-out clips that you can quickly remove it with. So we'll get this off, and then we'll try and use the fold-out clip one on this to see if it's the same diameter hole for the chute. And with this off, you can see that the other chute fits on it perfectly. So I know both are the same diameter and they're both interchangeable. So I'll be able to use the good remotely adjustable chute on the red snowblower. Now we can quickly pull off the worm drive that controls which direction the chute is going. That's just down there with a cotter pin. Just need to bend those back and push it through. And then once you get it pulled out, always put the pin back in so you don't lose it. You can fold it back so it's not going to fall back out. Next thing I need to do is make sure that the arms will work between the two of them. So I'll take them both off and see if I can fit the arms I want to use onto the frame I want to use. As hoped, they line up perfectly, and I'm able to put the arms on and the chute on, and everything is going to work quite well in that area. Now I just need to get the engine onto the new frame. The engines on these are only mounted with 4 simple bolts, come right out, and then the engine comes right out. It's pretty quick and painless. The transmissions on these are actually a pretty ingenious design. The little rubber wheel you see that runs against that disc is moved back and forth by the shifter lever, and the closer it is to the center of the pulley that it's running on, the slower it's going to move, the slower it'll move the wheels. So when you shift, you're actually moving it out towards the edge, which makes it move the wheels faster, because that is spun directly off the engine. What is happening when you pull the lever to engage the drive is that you're taking that pulley and pushing it up against the little wheel. So that cable just takes that and pushes it right up against that little wheel, which is directly connected to the axle and tire. On my first attempt at this, I tried to use the existing shifting arm, which is all metal as opposed to a cable pull, and use the existing shifting assembly, which I had to change later on. I was able to make it work by just making the hole bigger for the rod to go through, but it ended up shifting backwards, and I'll explain that in a little bit. The first thing I wanted to do was get the starter fixed on this, primarily because it's going to my father, and it'll be a lot easier for him to just plug it in and push the start button. So we're going to get this starter pulled off and see if we can figure out what's wrong with it. My biggest guess right now is that the Bendix is not engaging. This is the piece that slides the gear into the flywheel on the engine and turns it over. Pro tip for you, if you put the screws back into the holes you took them out of, you won't lose them. Before we work on that though, we're going to do some sandblasting. The weather's good, so I can take it over to the garage and get some of this rust knocked off. With some new bolts to hold the chute down, we now have a good working chute that is fully adjustable in all directions, and it seems to work extremely well on the new body. So we're going to work on the starter now, and the issue here is that the starter will spin, but the Bendix isn't engaging. This needs to, as it runs, pull into the engine. So the engine flywheel sits here, and when this runs, it's going to pull this in. Currently it's seized to the shaft. There's a spring that pushes it back when it's not running, but it sees right to the shaft. We need to free that up. If we can get that to free up, then our starter should start working again. And we are probably going to have to take this apart to be able to work on this. Doubt that we can get that to spin otherwise. It's an issue with sitting for months at a time, or years at a time in this case. I'm sure it sat for several years before I bought it, just going by the looks of it when I bought it. So let's pop the side of that off. E-clip in here, or a Jesus clip, which is what they call them when you get them off, because they fly in every direction. After much struggling, I decided that I need to just get it freed up with it in place, because I'm not able to get the head off with the tools I have handy. So I'm just holding the motor and prying at the gear itself. It's slowly starting to work its way down onto that. Now that should spin freely. The spring should just push that right back. The drive wheel is finally starting to move back and forth like it should. This movement will need to be flawless, however, before I put it back together. I'll get a little more lubrication in there. I then proceeded to fight for the next hour, trying to get that back in there with all 4 of the brushes and springs fitting in at the same time. What I eventually discovered is that 2 of the brush slides are set up so that you put the springs and brushes in place first, hold them in and slide the motor in, and then the other 2 are set up so that you put the springs in after the fact. And there's a little slot that you can use to compress the spring and slide the spring into after you've got everything in place. You can see that clearly on this still frame here. The 2 on the right have slots and the 2 on the left are just flat. With all the brush springs back in place, we can put the cover back on and put it all back together and test it out. What happens now? It has not returned. So that's working properly now, but I did spend the next 20 minutes or so trying to get that to free up as completely as possible. It just wasn't returning back the way it should. A new spring probably would have helped, but I didn't have that available. So I just got it as free as I could, and knowing the engine would kick it back when the engine starts. And now it's all back together and we can test it. My spark plug is currently disconnected, so I'm not worried about it starting. I just want to see if it's going to turn over the engine. Yes, it does. With the starter issue resolved, I can move on to the carburetor. I spent some time on this carburetor trying to figure out if I wanted to save it or not. The carburetor itself looks horrid. It's been out in the weather. It also has a spring-loaded drain valve on the bottom of it, and the gasket is leaking around that. So what I finally ended up doing is just getting a replacement carburetor from Amazon. It's honestly cheaper than trying to work on it and repair it, and much cheaper than a gasket kit, and they actually work pretty good. So perhaps the biggest challenge overall of this build is that the motor pulley system is different than the original frame. And what you can see here is that of the 2 pulleys, normally you have 2 pulleys in the same shaft that's coming out of the same motor. And any motor you pick up at like Harbor Freight or anything is going to be set up the same way. This Tecumseh, however, has 2 separate pulleys coming out of it. And to make matters worse, one of them runs in the opposite direction. The front pulley runs the auger and snowblower part of it. The back pulley runs the actual transmission piece of it. And with that running in an opposite direction of the front pulley, it's going to cause some really challenging things later on here in the video. And another part that I ran into is that the original setup, see the idler pulley there in the back, was set up in such a way that the belt was always rubbing against the motor shaft. So it's kind of like a design flaw to begin with. And what I've done is I've switched that pulley around, and I'm running it on the opposite side and running the belt up behind the actual main drive shaft, and with that tightened up on that idler pulley, that holds it away from that drive shaft. So it should see nice longer belt life, and we won't be rubbing it up against that drive shaft anymore. So now the big challenge is to hold that idler pulley tight against the belt to give you the proper tension. Now there's a spring that is included with that, and that was originally mounted to a spot on the engine, but with it switched to the other side, you need to do something different. So if I pull that spring, I can get that pulley tightened up properly. I need to develop some way to hold that spring over towards the side you're looking at to give nice good tension on that idler pulley. In order to hold that, I got pretty creative and used a bracket from a light. This is actually the bracket that connects onto a light box to hold up a ceiling fan or something along that, and bent it up and set it up such that I can clip the spring into any one of those holes. I'm going to use the big slot though, and then just bolt it right here to the side. And with my custom-made bracket all painted, I can now mount it in place. I'm going to add an extra screw to make sure it stays stable, and it is working quite well for holding the spring. And the initial test worked out quite well. It started right up. One thing I immediately discovered is the belts were slightly out of alignment, causing one of them to burn a little bit, so I shut it back down to reposition the engine. Got the engine back off, and here's our two separate problems. We need to move this back. This is about where the hole is in the motor, when the motor's lined up properly with the pulley system. So I need to notch these out, just so I have adjustable slop there. Just gonna run that hole up a little bit. And the second problem that I discovered, that I suspected, is that the drive shaft is backwards. So when this is in forward gears, it's going backwards. And when this is in reverse gears, it's going forward. Okay, so I figured out what the problem is with the drivetrain. So on this particular one, this is going to be the forward gear all the way over, and the reverse is the one that goes back towards the drive gear. On this one, this is the forward gear all the way to the left, and reverse is what goes back towards the drive gear. And the reason for that is, on this original snowblower, the engine, as I noted before, has two separate drive shafts, and they go in opposite directions, which is why the snowblower is going backwards. This segment here is about 20 minutes of me babbling and talking to myself and the camera about all the things that need to be changed before we can get this together and get it going in the right direction and the engine to fit in the right place. And I'm showing all this in the changes that I go through along the way, primarily because I don't want this to look like, oh, it's just a quick, simple, here you did it, he's an expert type thing. The channel is Master of None, and the point of being a Master of None is you can work your way through most anything. I'm not focused on just rebuilding snowblowers. I'm going into this knowing that I'm not an expert, but I'm going to continue working until I get it done. I'm using techniques, practices, do a little research. Anybody can do this. Anybody can work through this as long as they take the time to work through the problems as I'm doing here and come up with a solution. I think my spring solution worked out really well. I'm very happy with that. I don't have a metal shop, so I can't make it look absolutely perfect like some of the YouTubers, but I made do with a piece of, that's actually a standoff for a ceiling fan. So it did the trick, and it seems pretty solid, but we'll make it happen. So continuing on with disassembly of the drivetrain in this, and then we'll see if we can get it to fit in that. I've got some jigsaw blades, and I'm going to cut the metal here to give us a slot to cut out so I can shift the engine back to line up the pulleys better on this engine transplant into this frame. For tonight, we're going to change the mounting holes, and just received yesterday the new carburetor. So we're going to hook that up, get the engine mounted again with a new carburetor in it, test it out, make sure it's running right, and then we can work on replacing the transmission. So we've got a nice slot there that we can slide the engine back on. So we'll try it, see if that lines it up. We can move it more if we need to. but I think we might be good. So like this one, with the engine all the way back, this pulley sits forward a little bit from that one. It's kind of hard to see on the camera, but the belt's going this way down through, which just means I need to make the slots a little bit longer. And now on to replacing the carburetor in this. I actually filmed a lot of this, but since this isn't a video on replacing carburetors rather than video on building a snowblower, I had to kind of cut this for time. It's a pretty long video segment, and I'm already over 20 minutes. I do want to say I was super impressed with the Chinese carburetor I bought off of Amazon. Not only did it come looking identical, but it also came with all the knobs and stuff for the snowblower, which is great. So I was able to replace all those and the gas lines that came with it. The only problem I had with it was the one spring came disconnected, and you'll see that right here. So notice that snaps back. This one is not. And there's a spring here that should be holding, so we need to bring that spring around and hook it onto this. I believe you can see that. So the spring here is not attached properly. It needs to be hooked into that little slot there. Just wind that back. Whoa! Oh no, I caught it. There. Now that works like it should. So I want to get the tubing fed through the back of this correctly, so I'm going to pull this cover off. And yes, it's still running backwards. Here is the last step of the process. I got the transmission pulled out of this guy. I had to go get my press out of storage. That was instrumental in getting this thing apart. These are variable seized. I had a hard time getting the wheel off. It was a lot of fighting and slow process and not really easy to film, so I didn't even bother, but I'll show you the aftermath. Got all that part, and then what I ended up using was only shift arm. And the reason for that is that the drive wheel that came out of the other transmission was too small. Hopefully you can see the diameter difference there between the two. So this is a smaller diameter, and which is going to change the position of this wheel and this flywheel. So I left this the same, but what I did was got this out, this drive axle. I was able to pull the nut out of the side here and then shove it this way. I couldn't get the wheels off. They were seized pretty bad, but they're pretty good. They got lots of good air, and I've never put a drop of air in these. These are nice as can be. But I got this, pulled it out so I could get this pin out and get the previous control arm out. I turned this around, so instead of going this way, it's now going this way. And then I used the control arm shifting linkage from the other one. I did have to grind off a significant part of it. I cut, because this used to come, used to come out like this far, so I had to cut this much off here, and then grind this part here so it'll shift properly. Now, when I run the linkage, the wheel misses all the way across. I can hit all the gears, including the top speed, and I just barely have enough gap there between the geared wheel and the drive shaft. So that's going to be fine there. So this is good. Just need to put this back together, and I think we're all set. Tomorrow night I'll get the engine back on it, and it should drive the correct direction for the shifting linkage, even with the engine running backwards, now that this is running the wheel in the right location. And the last thing we need to fix is the headlight, and I got it pulled out, and I think I figured out what the problem is. The bulb is missing. So just need to pick up a new bulb, and hopefully that will fix it.